Okay, so ready to dive into something kind of interesting?
Always.
Habits.
Yeah, habits.
Like, have you ever stopped to think about how much of our lives is basically just running on autopilot?
Oh, all the time.
It's wild, right? Like the book we're looking at today, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, this guy, he says it's over 40%. That's almost half our lives.
It's remarkable, and it really highlights how crucial it is to understand how habits work.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing today. Like, how do these things form? Why are they so hard to break? And most importantly, can we actually change them?
And Duhigg, by the way, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, so he knows a thing or two about this stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, one of the key things he talks about is this idea of a habit loop.
Right, which is essentially a three-part process. But before we jump into that, I think it's helpful to understand why our brains even form habits in the first place.
Yeah, good point.
Our brains are amazing, but they're also kind of lazy.
Lazy brains.
Well, think of it this way. Your brain is constantly seeking ways to be more efficient. It's like an energy-saving machine.
Okay, I can see that.
So when you do something over and over, your brain says, hey, I can create a shortcut here. And that shortcut is a habit.
So it's like our brain is just trying to save us mental energy.
Exactly. It's like, hey, I've got this routine down pat. I can free up some space for other things.
Yeah.
Like, have you ever driven home and then suddenly realized you don't even remember the trip?
Oh, all the time. Scary. Right.
That's your habit loop in action. Your brain's on autopilot. So now you're free to think about, what's for dinner or what you're going to watch on TV.
So it's not always a bad thing.
Right. Habits can be incredibly useful. They allow us to function without having to think about every little thing.
Okay, so back to the habit loop. You said it's a three-part process.
Yeah. So first, there's a cue, which is basically the trigger that sets the whole thing off.
So it could be anything.
Pretty much. It could be a certain time of day, a particular location, an emotional state, even another person. Like, if you always have a cup of coffee when you wake up, the cue is waking up.
Makes sense. What's next?
Then comes the routine, which is the actual behavior itself.
Mm-hmm.
So in the coffee example, the routine is grinding the beans, brewing the coffee, all that jazz.
Right, and then the payoff.
Exactly, the reward. This is the part that reinforces the habit loop. It could be a feeling of pleasure, a sense of accomplishment, or even just relief from something unpleasant. In the coffee case, it might be that caffeine boost that gets you going in the morning. Or maybe it's that cozy feeling of holding a warm mug.
So it's basically that a moment that tells your brain, this was a good idea, let's do it again.
Precisely. And over time, as that loop repeats, your brain starts anticipating the reward even before you engage in the routine.
So it's not just about doing the thing, it's about the feeling you get from doing the thing.
Exactly. And this is where cravings come in.
Cravings.
Yeah, Duhigg says cravings are like the engine of the habit loop.
I never really thought about it that way.
So, you know how it is when you're trying to resist that piece of cake or that extra glass of wine?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That's your brain craving that reward, even if you know it's not the best choice. And the more you repeat the habit loop, the stronger that craving becomes.
Wow. This is getting kind of deep.
It is.
Right.
But it's super important to understand this because it helps explain why habits can be so hard to break. It's not just about willpower. It's about understanding the neurological processes that are happening under the hood.
So how do we use this knowledge to actually change our habits?
Well, Duhigg offers some really practical strategies. One of the most important is his golden rule of habit change.
Which is?
Keep the old cue and the old reward, but change the routine.
Okay, so it's like instead of trying to fight against that ingrained craving, you're basically rewiring the habit loop.
Exactly. You're outsmarting your brain instead of trying to overpower it. Like Duhigg uses this example of the stress smoking relief cycle.
Okay.
So the cue is feeling stressed. The routine is smoking a cigarette. And the reward is that temporary relief from the stress. But of course, the problem is smoking is terrible for you.
Right. So how would you apply the golden rule here?
You'd keep the cue, feeling stressed, and the reward, relief from the stress. But you'd find a new, healthier routine to get you there. Maybe it's going for a walk, listening to music, or calling a friend.
So you're still getting that stress relief, but without the negative consequences.
Exactly. And the key is to find a new routine that provides a similar reward. You're not trying to eliminate the craving altogether. You're just finding a better way to satisfy it.
This is actually brilliant. So you're saying that instead of trying to white-knuckle our way through habit change, we can actually work with our brains to make it easier.
Precisely. It's about understanding how habits work and then using that knowledge to our advantage.
Okay, so we've got cues, routines, rewards, and this golden rule of habit change. Anything else we should know before we start trying to hack our own habits?
Oh, there's so much more. But one thing I don't want to miss is this idea of keystone habits.
Keystone habits, what are those?
They're basically habits that have a ripple effect, creating positive change in other areas of your life.
So it's like one good habit leads to other good habits.
Exactly. Like, think about making your bed every morning. It seems like such a small thing, but studies show that people who make their beds are more productive, more organized, and even happier throughout the day.
Huh, interesting.
It's like that one small act of discipline sets the tone for everything else. It creates a sense of control and order that carries over into other parts of your life.
Wow, I'm going to have to try that.
You should. And Duhigg gives other great examples of keystone habits.
Yep.
Like in the corporate world, he talks about Alcoa, an aluminum company that was struggling with safety issues. They brought in a new CEO who focused on just one key change, worker safety. And the amazing thing is that this focus on safety didn't just improve their safety record. It actually led to a complete cultural shift within the company. Productivity went up, employee morale improved. It was incredible.
So it was like this one keystone habit, focusing on safety, created all these positive ripple effects.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how interconnected our habits really are, and it highlights how even small changes can have a huge impact on our lives.
Okay, so we've covered cues, routines, rewards, the golden rule, and now these keystone habits. Where does willpower fit into all of this?
Willpower, the age-old struggle.
Right. Like, is it just about resisting that second slice of cake or getting up early for the gym?
Well, it's definitely part of it,
Yeah.
but the research shows that willpower is actually a habit itself.
Wait, really? You can train your willpower.
You can. It's like a muscle that you can strengthen through practice. And like any muscle, you can get tired if you overuse it.
So if I'm trying to resist temptation all day long, my willpower muscle is going to get exhausted.
Exactly. And that's when you're more likely to give in. That's why it's so important to be strategic about how you use your willpower.
So how do we strengthen our willpower muscle? Is it just about resisting temptation?
That's one way to do it. But even smaller acts of self-control, repeated over time, can make a difference, like sticking to your to-do list, for example, or even just saying no to that extra cup of coffee.
So it's not about being superhuman, it's about those consistent, smaller choices.
Exactly. It's about building those willpower habits.
So we've got willpower as a muscle. Anything else?
Oh, there are a few other things. Like Duhigg talks about the importance of planning for temptations.
Planning for temptations.
Yeah, like anticipating those moments when your willpower might be low and having a plan in place for how you'll handle them. So instead of relying solely on willpower in the heat of the moment, you're setting yourself up for success in advance.
So if I know I tend to overeat at parties, for example, I should have a plan for how I'm going to approach the food table.
Exactly. It takes the pressure off in the moment when your willpower might be depleted. And then there's sleep and diet.
Oh, right. Those are important too.
They're essential. They're the foundation for physical and mental energy. If you're not getting enough sleep or eating nutritious food, your willpower reserves are going to be much lower.
So it's like trying to run a marathon on an empty stomach. You're not going to get very far.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all super helpful for understanding how our own habits work, but what about organizations? Did they have habits too?
They absolutely do. In fact, Duhigg dedicates a whole section of the book to exploring how habits operate in organizations, and it's fascinating stuff.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So organizations develop habits just like individuals do. These are often referred to as routines or truces that can be both beneficial and problematic.
So are you talking about things like customer service scripts or the way a product is manufactured, like those standardized procedures you encounter when you interact with a company?
Exactly. These routines develop over time, almost like unwritten rules. And they can be great for streamlining operations and making things more efficient.
That makes sense. But how can these routines become a problem?
Well, they can create blind spots, lead to outdated practices, and make it difficult for organizations to adapt to new situations. It's like they get stuck in a rut. But on the flip side, Duhigg argues that crises can actually be a catalyst for change in organizations.
Oh, interesting. So instead of reinforcing the old ways of doing things, a crisis can actually shake things up and force people to reevaluate their habits.
Exactly. Crises disrupt existing patterns and create opportunities to reshape those organizational habits. Think about NASA's safety culture after the Challenger disaster. That tragic event forced them to completely overhaul their protocols and procedures.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how crisis can lead to necessary change, albeit under devastating circumstances.
It is, and it highlights how even in organizations, habits can be both powerful and adaptable.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From the nitty-gritty of the habit loop to the power of keystone habits and the role of willpower, and even how organizations develop habits. Is there anything else that stood out to you in the book?
One of the most inspiring aspects is Duhigg's emphasis on the role of belief in changing habits. He quotes a researcher who says, "For a habit to stay changed, people must believe change is possible."
Wow, that's so powerful. It's not enough to just know how to change. You have to believe that you actually can.
Exactly. Belief is essential. And one way to strengthen that belief is through support systems. Surrounding yourself with people who encourage you and believe in you can make all the difference.
I've heard that's one of the secrets behind the success of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not just about the program itself, it's about the community, the shared belief in the possibility of change.
Exactly. It's a testament to the power of collective belief.
This is all incredibly insightful. I'm already starting to think about some habits I want to change.
Me too.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in the power of habit.
Luckily for us, we have 2 more parts to this deep dive. We'll be back after a quick break to delve deeper into Duhigg's insights and discover even more practical strategies for harnessing the power of habit.
And one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is that Duhigg doesn't just talk about the science of habits.
Right.
He actually brings it to life with all these stories, about real people.
Absolutely. And those stories, they're what make it so memorable.
Right.
Like, for example, he talks about Michael Phelps,
Oh, yeah.
the Olympic swimmer,
Yeah.
and how habits played such a huge role in his success.
Right.
So Phelps's coach, he instilled this pre-race routine that was so deeply ingrained,
Yeah.
it's practically automatic.
Like clockwork.
In this routine, it helped him stay focused and perform at his best, even under immense pressure.
It's like he programmed himself for success.
Yeah, exactly.
The starting block was the cue.
Right.
His meticulously practiced movements and visualizations were the routine.
Right.
And the feeling of victory was the reward.
It's amazing how a simple routine can have such a huge impact on performance,
Totally.
whether you're an Olympic athlete or just trying to get through your workday.
Absolutely. And it's not just athletes who can benefit from this.
Yeah.
Think about musicians, surgeons, anyone who performs under pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Having a reliable routine can make all the difference.
Yeah, it's like having a mental anchor in the midst of chaos.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've seen how habits can work for individuals, but Duhigg also talks about how they operate in social movements, right?
Yeah, he uses the example of the Montgomery bus boycott, which was sparked by Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat.
Right.
But what's fascinating is that the boycott's success wasn't just about a single act of defiance.
Right.
It was about the power of a community coming together and forming new habits.
Yeah, they created new routines for transportation, for communication, for supporting each other. And it's so inspiring how those new habits, those collective actions, ultimately led to profound social change.
It shows you that habits can be a force for good,
Totally.
not just on a personal level, but on a societal level as well.
It's a powerful reminder that our individual habits are part of a larger ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely.
But of course, not all habits are created equal.
True.
And Duhigg, he doesn't shy away from the darker side of this.
Yeah.
One of the most thought-provoking sections of the book is where he explores how companies manipulate our habits for profit.
That's right. He talks about how businesses invest heavily in understanding consumer behavior, using data and psychology to create products and marketing campaigns that trigger our habit loops.
Like those irresistible buy now buttons
Yeah.
and the endless scroll feature on social media. It's almost like we're being programmed to consume.
It's definitely something to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
These tactics are designed to keep us hooked, to keep us clicking and buying.
Right.
It highlights the importance of being conscious consumers, making intentional choices, rather than just reacting to these carefully crafted cues.
Yeah, we need to be mindful of the routines and rewards that are being engineered to influence our behavior.
For sure.
So we've talked about how to change our habits,
Right.
but how do we even begin to identify those habits we want to change in the first place?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, Duhigg provides a simple framework for that.
Okay.
He says to start by identifying the routine, the cue, and the reward that make up the habit loop.
Okay, so let's break that down.
Okay.
How do we pinpoint those 3 elements?
Let's say you want to break the habit of mindlessly scrolling through social media before bed.
Oh, yeah.
First, really observe yourself.
Okay.
What's the routine? It's that familiar act of picking up your phone and opening the app.
I think we're all familiar with that routine.
Right now, what's the cue? Is it a specific time of night? A feeling of boredom or loneliness? Or maybe just seeing your phone on the nightstand?
That's a good point.
Sure.
The cue can be very subtle.
It can. And finally, what's the reward? Is it the distraction from the day's stresses? A fleeting sense of connection? Or maybe just the fear of missing out?
Okay, so once we've identified the routine, the cue, and the reward, what's next? How do we actually start changing the habit?
Remember the golden rule of habit change?
Yeah, keep the cue and reward the same, but change the routine.
Exactly. Duhigg suggests experimenting with different rewards to see if you can find a healthier alternative that satisfies the same craving.
So in the case of social media scrolling, instead of seeking that sense of connection online, maybe you could spend a few minutes reading a book, listening to music, or talking to a loved one.
Exactly. You're still addressing that need for relaxation or connection, but in a more fulfilling way.
That makes sense. And remember, belief plays a huge role in successful habit change.
Oh, absolutely.
You have to believe that change is possible.
You do.
But what if you're struggling to believe in yourself?
That's where support systems come in.
Right.
Surrounding yourself with people who encourage you and support your goals can make a world of difference.
Whether it's a friend, a family member, a support group, or even an online community, having that sense of accountability and encouragement can really boost your chances of success.
It really can.
I've also heard that breaking down big goals into smaller steps can be really helpful.
You're absolutely right. That's the concept of small wins.
Right.
Instead of trying to change everything at once, focus on those incremental steps that build momentum and make the larger goal less daunting.
So instead of vowing to never touch social media again, you might start by putting your phone away an hour before bed.
Exactly. It's a much more manageable approach. And as you experience those small victories, your confidence grows, and the bigger changes become less overwhelming.
This is great. I'm already starting to think about some habits I want to change.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
You're right. There's so much more to explore in The Power of Habit. It's a book that can truly change the way you think about your actions and your potential.
Yeah, I think our listeners are going to be fascinated by what we uncover in the next part of this deep dive. We'll pick up where we left off, exploring more real-world examples and getting even more practical with tips for applying these insights to your own life. All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the power of habit. I'm really curious to hear more of those real-world stories you mentioned.
Oh yeah, they're amazing. Duhigg is a great storyteller. He really knows how to bring these concepts to life.
So tell me, what are some of the stories that really stuck with you?
Well, one that I found particularly inspiring was the story of Tony Dungy.
Tony Dungy.
Yeah, he was the coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, known for being super calm and his ability to turn around struggling teams.
Yeah, I vaguely remember hearing about him, but I don't really know much about his coaching style. What was his secret?
Well, Dungy, he was really big on building good habits through repetition and positive reinforcement. So instead of focusing on punishing mistakes, he'd emphasize practicing the right behaviors over and over again until they became second nature.
So he was basically applying the principles of habit formation to his entire coaching philosophy.
Exactly. He understood that success wasn't just about talent. It was about creating a culture of discipline and consistency through habits. And his approach was incredibly effective. He transformed the Buccaneers from a losing team into Super Bowl champions.
Wow, that's really impressive. It's amazing how those same principles that help us form simple habits, like brushing our teeth, can also be applied to achieve success on such a huge scale.
Totally. And it's not just about sports or business. These principles can be applied to any area of life.
Okay, so we've seen how habits can drive success in sports and business. But what about for the rest of us? What kind of practical advice does Duhigg offer for, improving our everyday lives?
Well, a lot of it goes back to that framework we discussed earlier. Identifying the routine, the cue, and the reward.
Right. Becoming aware of those automatic behaviors that are driving our actions.
Exactly. Once you've identified those elements, you can start experimenting with different approaches to, change the routine. For example, if you're trying to break a bad habit, one strategy is to make it more difficult to perform the routine.
Okay, so if I'm trying to cut back on snacking, I might keep those tempting snacks out of sight.
Yeah, exactly. Or even out of the house altogether.
Yeah.
You're basically removing the cue or making the routine more inconvenient, which can help weaken that habit loop.
And what about if I'm trying to build a good habit?
Well, in that case, you want to make it as easy as possible to stick to the routine. So, like, if you're trying to start exercising regularly, you might lay out your workout clothes the night before.
Or find a workout buddy?
Exactly. Anything that helps you reduce friction and make it more likely that you'll follow through.
That makes sense. It's about setting ourselves up for success. And what about those moments when we're feeling tempted to slip back into old habits? Does Duhigg have any advice for dealing with those challenges?
Oh, yeah. He talks about having a plan in place, like anticipating those situations where you might be tempted and then coming up with a strategy in advance for how you're going to handle it.
So it's like pre-committing to a specific course of action.
Right. Instead of relying solely on willpower in the heat of the moment, you're giving yourself a clear plan to follow. So if you know you tend to overeat at parties, for example, you might decide in advance that you'll only fill your plate once or that you'll focus on socializing instead of the food.
That's a great idea. It takes the pressure off in the moment when your willpower might be low. And, one thing I found really helpful is celebrating those small wins, like acknowledging your progress, no matter how small it may seem.
Oh, absolutely. Celebrating small wins is so important. It's easy to get discouraged if you're only focused on the end goal. But recognizing those little victories along the way can help you stay motivated and remind you that you're actually making progress.
It's a good reminder that change is a process. It doesn't happen overnight.
Exactly. And it's a journey. There will be setbacks and challenges along the way, but it's important to keep believing in yourself and to keep moving forward.
This has been such an insightful deep dive into the power of habit. I feel like I've learned so much about how these often invisible forces shape our lives.
It's definitely been eye-opening. But what I find most exciting is the realization that we're not just, puppets to our habits. We have the power to understand them, change them, and use them to create the lives we want.
That's a really empowering message. We can actually shape our own destinies, one habit at a time.
Exactly. And I think that's a great place to leave our listeners. So as you go about your day, pay attention to your own habits. What are those cues, routines, and rewards that are shaping your actions? And what's one small habit you could change this week that you truly...
That's a fantastic question. And with that, we wrap up our deep dive into the power of habit. We hope you enjoyed this journey and are feeling inspired to take control of your own habits. Until next time, keep those habit loops spinning in the right direction.